Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheila, and I have this week's Christmas story for you. It's called The Sheaf of Grain, and it's one of my favorite Christmas stories. While young Mike was standing in the window of his living room, and he was looking down the road toward his grandfather's filling station. That's what they used to call the gas stations, was filling stations. And as he was looking, he also looked down the road there. And standing in front of every single house was a pole with a sheaf of grain tied to it. Mike looked at those poles and that grain with satisfaction, and he said, "Ma, can I go be with Grandpa?" Well, Mother walked over and she said, "I often wonder if it's that you want to go be with your grandpa, or if tonight, since it's Christmas Eve, you just want to hear Grandpa's Christmas story." Mike, he kind of grinned. He loved Grandpa's Christmas story. Mother stood there and she looked outside too. And she said, "I think that all of us just put up that grain every year to please your grandfather. It's not for anything else." And Mike said, "No, Mom, it's for the birds and for Olaf." And Mother said, "Everybody but your grandfather knows that Olaf had to have died in that storm. Nobody could have survived that snowstorm." But Mike loved the story, and he, like Grandpa, wished for a good ending to that story. Finally, Mother turned around and she said, "You can go, but make sure you have Grandpa lock up the filling station and you guys are home by 10 o'clock tonight." Well, Mike jumped up and he got on his warm things and he disappeared out into that snow. As he passed each house, he could see the pole and the grain. Well, as he was walking, a big car pulled up there in front of that filling station, and Mike ran because he wanted to know who it was. A big, tall man got out of the car. He was dressed in a navy blue uniform, and he had on a hat with a small brim that was covered in gold braid. As Mike was contemplating that, young Mike, his grandfather, who also was named Mike, that young Mike was named after, came out of the front of the filling station, and before he could say much to the stranger, that big, tall stranger looked at Grandpa and he said, "What's all the poles and the grain for?" And Grandpa kind of grinned. He said, "Do you have time for a story, sir?" The man looked at Grandpa and he said, "There's always time for a story." And Grandpa called him Captain. And Mike thought, "I've never seen a sea captain before." Well, that big, tall stranger made his way into the little filling station. And Grandfather, he pointed to a chair that was over beside their little stove. And he said, "Have a seat." But the man kind of shook his head, and he walked over into the shadowy corner of that little room, and he sat down on a chair that was sitting there. And he kind of pulled his hat down over his eyes. But he sat down to hear that story. Well, Grandpa and Mike both got real close to that stove. It was really chilly out there on the plains with that snow blowing. Well, when Grandpa had gotten comfortable, he smiled at the stranger and he started his story. Years ago, there was a rancher and his wife who moved here on the plains. He and his wife loved children, but as the years went by, none of them came to bless their home. So the two of them made a decision. It was during the Great Depression in the 1920s. America was full of starving, hungry people because there was no work. Well, there was lots of children that needed help. And the rancher and his wife decided that they would take in homeless boys. Well, it wasn't too long till the first one came meandering in, and he was given a home. And it wasn't long after that till every room in the house was full of homeless boys. And the rancher's wife and the rancher were thrilled to have every one of them. My, were they a rough and wild lot, though. Might of fact, the old rancher was forever having to go to the little school and get them out of some scrap or the other that they'd gotten themselves in. And the same way in town, he was forever having to go to town to bring them home. The people in that community, they would say to him, "You're raising that bunch of wild, rough guys just for the jailhouse." And the rancher said, "Maybe so." When spring came, there was another kind of lad that came. He was bigger than the rest of the boys. Some would say he was strong as an ox. Others said he was as strong as a winter storm. But although he was big and strong, there was something kind and gentle about him. And when he had got there, the rancher had asked him his name, and he had said, "Olaf Jensen. I come from over the sea. That's where my people live." Well, the rancher, he welcomed him, and it wasn't long. It was very obvious that the rancher and his wife loved Olaf. Well, they loved every one of those boys. But they were so hard to handle, it didn't always show quite as much to the boys anyway. And all those other homeless boys, they hated Olaf. So, when the rancher and his wife were gone, they were as mean as they could be to Olaf. Well, one day, several things had happened after Olaf came. One was that during that summer and that fall, everyone realized that when Olaf planted flowers, they bloomed before everybody else's. It seemed like just because he was so kind to them. And the birds liked to come and be around him and sing. And you know, the ornery critters that lived there on the ranch, all Olaf had to do was speak to them, and they would settle right down. The other boys couldn't do any of those things. Well, when winter came, one day Olaf went outside, and he took a big pole, and he pounded it about 500 yards from the door of the house. And he tied a big sheaf of grain to it So it sat kind of like this on the top, and it was full of grain. And the birds loved to come and sit on it and eat. Well, once again, the rancher and his wife were gone, and the boys, led by Mike, who seemed to be the ringleader of all the naughtiness that happened, he ran over, he and the other boys, and they pulled that pole down, and they spread that grain everywhere. Well, every time they took it down, Olaf went and he put it back up with another sheaf of grain on it. Time and time and time again, he did that, always putting it back up. Well, finally, it wasn't as fun anymore, and so the boys stopped. Well, later on in the day, a little bird came flying and landed on top of the grain for breakfast, probably, was eating that grain. Well, Mike saw that bird, and he was disgusted. He took out his slingshot, he put a rock in it, and he threw it, and he had a really good aim. And that tiny little bird went fluffing down on the snow and just lay there. Well, Olaf saw Mike do it. Olaf loved all living things. He went over and he gently picked up that little bird and he rubbed it, those tiny little feathers. But he realized that the bird was dead. He gently set it down on the snow, and his face became hard and angry. Nobody had ever seen Olaf mad before. His eyes were flashing blue fire. The boys were frightened by the look on Olaf's face, and he ran over and he grabbed Mike, and he threw him down in the snow, and he fell down on top of him, and with those huge big fists, he started beating on Mike. Beating, 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 beating. And the other boys, they looked on. Then they ran over and they tried to pull Olaf off of Mike, and they said, "Stop, stop. You're going to kill him. Stop." Well, after a little while, the madness, the anger, all started to burn away. And Olaf, he didn't touch Mike again. He stood up and he looked at the boys, all of them, and he said, "I go now. I cause nothing but unhappiness to this place. My heart is broken. Perhaps, if it heals, I will return." And he pulled his coat tight around his neck, and he walked off into that snowstorm. The boys, they rushed over and they picked up Mike, stood him up on his feet. They brushed him off, and they could just barely see Olaf disappearing into that whirling snow. The boys knew that they had done wrong. They had been so mean that they finally made kind, gentle Olaf. They kept thinking, it's 20 miles to the next town. He can't make it through this storm. By then, it was not just a winter storm, it was a blizzard. The wind had picked up and it was blowing. Snow was blowing everywhere. Finally, the boys talked among themselves. They hadn't gone in the house. They decided, We have to tell the rancher what happened." So they went in the house. He was sitting in his chair, the rancher was, and Mike went forward. The boys all stood in a line, and Mike said, "Olaf left. He's out in the storm somewhere." And then Mike told the whole story. When he got done, the rancher stood up big and tall, and he looked at the boys. The boys were sure the rancher would be mad, but his face showed only sadness. And he turned to the boys, he looked at each one of them individually, and he said, "Oh, sons, where have I failed you? Where have I failed you?" And he went and he got his coat and all of his winter wraps on, and he went out to the barn and he saddled a horse and he rode off into that blizzard. The boys didn't know what to do. They waited and they waited. Finally, it was late at night and the old man wasn't back yet. They knew they had to do something. They put on all their winter clothes and they went out to the barn and they each saddled a horse and they made a long line and they started going in the direction that they had seen Olaf. As they rode, they hollered out to each other, calling out each other's names because they didn't want to lose anybody in that blinding snow. It was dark. They went on and on and on and on, and when they thought they couldn't go any further, and it was so cold, they saw something in the snow, and they rode over and jumped off their horses. And there, half buried in the snow, was that kind old rancher. They unburied him from the snow and they wrapped him in their own coats. And they kind of knew where they were, and they knew there was a line shack not far from there. So they carried the rancher there. Well, they brought that rancher in and they built a fire in the little stove. They tried to make him as comfortable as they could, but by now he had a raging fever. And the boys knew that if they didn't get help and get medicine and warm food for him, he would certainly die. The boys talked among themselves in the corner of that line shack. They cast lots to see who should go get help, and Mike was chosen. Mike felt like this was all his fault anyway, so he got on his horse and he rode in the direction that he was sure was home. He rode and he rode and he rode. Hours and hours and hours passed. Finally, he stopped to look around, and a noise from who knows what came out of the prairie, and it scared his horse, and the horse kicked him off the back, and he landed in the snow. And there lay Mike, and he reached out to grab the reins, but the horse was so spooked that it ran away. And because of the blizzard, Mike couldn't even see where he went. There he lay. Finally, he knew he couldn't lay there. He got up and he started going, walking as fast as he could in the direction that he hoped was home. On and on he walked. Finally, he felt like his strength was all gone, and he fell in the snow again. And there he lay, and he thought, maybe I can crawl. So he'd reached his hands out in front of him, and he felt something. It was a pole. Then he reached up further. He stood up, and he felt it. He was close enough he could see. It was Olaf's pole with the grain on it for the birds. And Mike knew that he was close to home. Olaf's pole saved not only Mike, but the old rancher, because Mike had been able to find the house and send out help, and they had been able to save the old man's life. Well, that stranger in the corner, he'd spoken a couple times when the boys were being so mean to Olaf. He had asked quietly, he said, "Did Olaf ever fight back?" And of course, Grandpa had told him about the one time that Mike had. Now, he turned to Grandpa again and he said, "Did anyone ever find Olaf?" Grandpa shook his head sadly. "That's why we put out the poles with the grains on it," Mike said. Young Mike, not grandfather, but young Mike. He said, "That's why we put out the poles and why we put out the grain for the birds and for Olaf." And then the man said an interesting thing. He said, "And the other boys, what happened to them?" Now Grandpa broke in and he said, "They changed. They tried to be good sons to the old rancher. They tried to be good men when they grew up." And Mike had broke in as well, young Mike, and he said, "And a lot of them still live around here, and their sons and their daughters still live in the area. And they're all good men now." Well, it was after that was said that the stranger in the corner stood up to his full height. There was only one little light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and when that stranger stood up, he pulled off his sea captain's hat. His hair was snow white, but when he got under the light bulb, it was the color of flaxen, ripe wheat, golden wheat. And Grandfather stood up, and he looked at him, and he said, "Olaf! Olaf!" Well, Olaf stuck out his hands to Grandpa. He recognized the old man was Mike. Olaf and Grandfather stood there for a long time, and young Mike felt that it was fitting that the two old men should end the story together. And Mike hurried home. His heart was so full. Now there was a happy ending to Grandpa's story. And now Olaf, he knew that he hadn't caused unhappiness. He had helped all those boys become good men. And now Olaf was alive. All those years at sea must have mended his broken heart, and he had returned to see if they were still the same anymore. Young Mike ran home to tell Mother the good news. Olaf was home. Thank you, boys and girls. I'll see you next week.